The first rumor was that the mountain took them, that on a brittle morning at the end of fall, when frost silvered fence lines and the highway wore a thin skin of light, David Kincaid buckled his 6-year-old son Lucas into a car seat that still smelled faintly of apples and sunscreen, turned the key on a tired SUV, and drove into a switchback that cut the sky clean in half. People prefer to blame geography. It is easier to say a ridgeline ate a whole family than to imagine the sharper edge of human intent. But rumors don't hold the road for long. Months later, a hunter found the SUV in a dry creek bed where brush braided itself around metal-like fingers around a secret. The body panels were dulled to a greenish bruise. The windshield was a spider's cathedral. The plates wore dust like a disguise. Inside, a pack of mint gum collapsed into itself, a receipt for gas folded into a paper mountain, and a small red sneaker with Velcro stars pressed flat, as if the weight of time had learned a new kind of patience. The gear lever was frozen in drive, as if momentum had only paused, never stopped. No bodies, no footprints, no spray of safety glass glittering the banks, no obvious path carved by panic. Just the stillness that follows a held breath. And 1997 hardened into 1998, and then into something that had seasons, but no calendar. The milk in the Kincaid refrigerator soured and was replaced. The answering machine blinked itself into a permanent red eye. On the kitchen corkboard, a school picture of Lucas began to curl at the edges, turning his smile into a question mark. On a wall calendar, David's handwriting stopped in the middle of a week. Oil change, rent, call nothing after call. The promise of a voice that never came. Volunteers went out anyway. They formed bright lines through cattails and deadfall. A canine team worked creek bends where children once caught frogs. Divers touched the bottom of reservoirs where shopping carts slept, and came up with mud and rumors. A helicopter stitched circles over a canyon that had kept more secrets than water. Every search ended with the same sentence the wind whispered back: nothing found. Somewhere in town, someone started saying, maybe they ran. That the father owed money he couldn't pay to a shadow without a name. Another person said they had seen the SUV weeks earlier, near a truck stop 2 counties over, that they remembered the back window taped in an L of clear plastic, and that the boy had eaten purple candy at the counter while the man counted change. Memory is a magician. It lets you volunteer it for tricks you don't understand. The last clean morning was put back together with receipts and a convenience store clerk's timeline that sharpened only when she saw an old photo and flinched. They bought gas and a drink. Lucas reached for grape gum. David said it would make him carsick and chose mint instead, and apologized on the way out, like fathers do when they trade wonder for wisdom without meaning to. A camera above the door captured the moment a hand hovered over a small shoulder and did not quite touch, protection like a shadow. The SUV turned left at the intersection that always punishes the impatient, and then the road peeled back into the story. In the evenings is the worst hour, when dishes are quiet and the house groans and there is nowhere to put your hands. Suppers were burned because someone forgot the flame while staring at a front door that didn't open. A neighbor sat in his idling sedan every dawn, as if his engine could bring another engine to life. Every town has its rituals for missing people. They look like superstition but feel like prayer. The crash itself refused to behave. The wash wasn't steep enough to flip a vehicle. The scrub should have slowed it. There were no gouge marks telling the familiar tale of speed and a bad decision, no scatter of glass upslope, and no headlight fragments blinking in the dirt. The seatbelts were frayed from years of ordinary use, not the violent strain of a last-second brace. The airbag modules had never breathed. The suction cup ring on the windshield, where a GPS once clung, showed a ghostly circle, but no unit lay anywhere nearby. If you pressed your ear into the silence between the front seats and the back one, investigator did, long after she was supposed to stop caring, you could hear only your own pulse. It did not feel like an accident. It felt like a pause where a sentence should be. Red herrings arrived with the reliability of the mail. A man in a brown jacket was asking directions 2 days before. A woman who swore she saw a child with a cowlick, just like Lucas's coloring a placemat in a diner 300 miles away. A letter slipped under a door, with 19 words cut from a newspaper, and arranged into a threat that read like poetry if you had been sleeping badly. Stop, or you will join them. Each lead lasted 1 week of work, 2 weeks of argument, and then sank. What kept breathing was quieter. A kindergarten teacher remembered the smell of construction paper and Elmer's, and the way Lucas had taken an extra apple at snack time to save for Dad. And she wept alone in a supply closet, because grief is classless and will find you wherever you hide it. A man from the next street over changed his route so he would pass the Kincaid house every morning. Not because he expected to see anything, but because his car knew that street, the way tongues remember cracked molars. The case shifted rooms after a while, because that's what cases do when fresh eyes are promised in exchange for old folders. A new wall, a different bulletin board. Somebody pulled the original tow records from the creekbed recovery and noticed a notation no one had cared about. Foreign residue under rear seat rail. Somebody else requested the weather archive for that week, because this is how truth sometimes begins, with barometric pressure and the shape of wind. The residue, when coaxed beneath a lens with more patience than most people have for strangers' pain, told a story that didn't belong to water. It had particulates of paint that wasn't from a roadside guardrail or a barn door, a chalky white that says fluorescent light and concrete, a whisper of ammonia, and the kind of alkaline scrub that lives in rooms meant to erase. Buildings leave a different kind of pollen. So do choices. The investigator, who never quite learned how to go home, sat in a parking lot, beneath a billboard for a lake you didn't have to share, and listened to a lab tech say, "This isn't a creek." The creek hadn't touched that fabric at all, not the way the building had. And if you can hide a vehicle, you can't hide what it drags through when it leaves and returns changed. The smear that had been ignored in the early photographs, the one on the back seat fabric that everyone thought was dust, was not dust. It was a breadcrumb. It meant the mountain might have been a stage, not a culprit. It meant somewhere, away from wind and trees and the indifferent honesty of rock, there was a door that had once opened to let a father and his son in, or to let an SUV out, scrubbed and staged and pushed into a narrative that wanted to be simple and refused. Years had turned the rumor into a fable. The smear turned it into a map. And maps, for all their lies, still point somewhere if you're willing to keep going when the asphalt runs out. The building was not remarkable, which is why no one had thought about it in 1997. It sat on the edge of an industrial strip where concrete turned to weeds, the kind of place people drove past on their way to somewhere that mattered. Its windows were clouded with dust that never learned how to be transparent, and the door swelled in bad weather until you had to shoulder it open. For a while it had been a repair shop, then a storage lease under a name that dissolved into a post office box, then nothing at all. Nothing that anyone admitted to, anyway. When the fibers from the SUV whispered about chemicals that belonged to walls, not sky, the file in the cold case unit pointed itself here, like a compass that had finally stopped spinning. The agent who drove out that first morning described the air as sour, not quite oil, not quite bleach, but something in between that clung to the back of the throat. Inside, the building was stripped to ribs, a concrete floor spidered with stains, walls patched where machinery had once leaned, and fluorescent tubes that flickered like they were remembering how to glow. The space had been scrubbed in the way a guilty conscience scrubs, hard enough to erase, but never quite enough to forget. Along the back wall, a rectangular discoloration told of something large, once pressed flush against it, shielding paint from time. A vehicle-sized absence. There was no sign of David or Lucas. Not then. just residue, a trace of adhesive where tape had bitten into cement, and a bent nail where something had been tethered. But the building was patient, and patience works on investigators the way gravity works on water. They came back with ground-penetrating radar. They came back with luminol, with lights that revealed stains like constellations across a blank sky. And in the northern corner, beneath a thin coat of paint, the shadows of a handprint bloomed too small to belong to David. The story began to bend. Witnesses long ignored were dragged back into memory. A night clerk remembered a man in coveralls paying cash for coffee in bills folded so many times they looked like origami. He had grease under his nails and a smile that didn't match his eyes. He'd come from the direction of the building, though the clerk had never thought to mention it. A trucker remembered headlights pulling out of the lot at an hour when no one had business there. A neighbor, decades later, admitted that he'd heard what he thought was a child crying, muffled through metal and distance, but he'd rolled over, convinced it was a fox. Memory is a cruel witness, always late, always partial. By the time the FBI pulled the building's old lease records, the company name was nothing but paper dust. But a bank trail led to a man whose name had surfaced once before in a different file. A man known for debts that turned sour. A man who'd rented space big enough to hide more than tools. It was not enough to arrest him. Not yet. But it was enough to dig deeper. Enough to start asking why the SUV looked staged, why the crash had not crashed, and why the seatbelt marks were lies. David's family had lived in limbo for years, their grief boxed and unboxed like Christmas ornaments. His brother kept a shoebox of newspaper clippings under his bed, pulling them out every few months to reread until the words blurred. Lucas's classmates had graduated, their yearbook pages filled with plans for colleges and road trips, while his picture remained forever elementary, forever waiting. Every unanswered question aged alongside them. And still, the SUV in the creek bed refused to explain itself. An engineer brought in for consultation traced the angles, the slope, and the damage, and said the math didn't work. A car can't land that way without help. It had been placed, pushed, and guided, which meant David hadn't lost control. Control had been taken from him. The case notes began to echo the same phrase over and over. Deliberate staging. That single phrase cracked the story open like a fault line. It meant the building wasn't just a detour. It was the center. It meant the rumor of the mountain swallowing them had always been a cover for hands more deliberate than rockfall. It meant someone had wanted them gone, and wanted it to look like chance. What no one could yet answer was why. Why a father who never missed rent, who bought mint gum to avoid car sickness, who circled dates on a calendar like promises. Why a boy who loved apples, who saved one for his dad during snack time, whose Velcro sneakers had stars that still glimmered after a decade under dirt. A father and son, erased not by wilderness, but by a building with walls too smooth, with stains too stubborn, with secrets too patient. The investigation had shifted from tragedy to crime, and crimes have culprits, even if time tries to bury them. The first truth was that David and Lucas Kincaid did not fall victim to the mountain. The second truth was more dangerous. Someone had helped them vanish, and that someone had left just enough behind for the trail to start again. The crash site, once considered a grave, was now reclassified as a stage. The SUV had been propped against a rock, like a body arranged for an open casket, every angle calculated to whisper accident. The problem was, accidents don't whisper. They shout in jagged lines, scattered glass, and twisted frames. What investigators now saw was choreography, the neatness of someone who wanted to control the story. Tires bore shallow grooves, not the chaotic tearing of panic braking. The windshield fracture radiated outward from a single calculated blow, not the spiderweb shatter of high-speed impact. Even the mud on the undercarriage looked painted, collected from elsewhere, and slapped on in handfuls. The SUV had been sleeping, not crashing. Years earlier, the first responders hadn't thought to question it. Why would they? Missing persons so often ended in tragedy explained by terrain. Rivers swallowed, avalanches buried. Engines failed in the wrong weather. People wanted neat endings, even when they were sad. It was easier that way. But now, standing over the wreck with new knowledge, the FBI agent asked aloud the question that cracked open the silence. Who staged this? The file records note that moment as the pivot. Once you believe in staging, everything else becomes performance. And performances require an audience. The audience, in this case, was everyone who was supposed to stop asking questions. If the crash said it was over, then families grieved, papers printed eulogies, and law enforcement closed their binders. But the audience hadn't clapped. David's father had spent 2 decades telling anyone who would listen that it didn't add up, that his son was too careful a driver, too devoted a dad to simply vanish on a curve. People had rolled their eyes, indulgent of a grieving old man. But he'd been the only one refusing to applaud a play he knew was false. What if he had been right all along? The search for truth turned backward through records long considered stale. Gas station receipts found in the SUV's glove box were scanned again. One, crumpled and half-faded, placed David at a pump less than a mile from the industrial building on the very day he disappeared. Another, for a convenience store sandwich, time-stamped later than the supposed time of the crash. The timeline stretched in impossible ways. Witnesses once discounted were revisited. A man recalled seeing the SUV parked oddly, not on the roadside but tucked deep into the industrial lot, where no one parked unless they belonged. A waitress remembered a boy's shoes tapping against the vinyl booth as he sucked on a straw, but she hadn't thought to connect it with the news reports days later. Memories were fragile, but they began aligning like constellations once dismissed as random stars. In the new narrative, David had not driven off the road. He had driven into something, the building, the trap. And then, he had been removed. The SUV delivered it to its stage later, lifeless as a puppet. But this theory led to a darker possibility, that for hours, maybe days after the world thought them dead, David and Lucas had been alive. In the FBI's briefing room, silence fell whenever that was spoken. Alive meant choices, terror, and bargaining. Alive meant someone had to decide when they would stop being alive. And that thought gnawed at everyone, because it opened a hole deeper than any mountain ravine. The suspects list widened. Anyone connected to the building's leases, anyone whose debts or grudges touched David's orbit, anyone who benefited from his silence. Old friends with soured partnerships, employers with missing funds, and even neighbors who once argued over property lines. Each name was dragged through databases, their histories cross-stitched with maps and receipts. Patterns began to breathe. One man's name appeared too often, tied to the lease, tied to the bank account, and tied to a cash withdrawal days before the disappearance. He had since moved states, remarried, and changed jobs like clothes. But his shadow remained over the building like a watermark. Agents followed him discreetly, their reports cold and technical. He mowed his lawn at 6 p.m. He bought decaf coffee. He jogged 3 times a week. But buried in the ordinary were cracks. A shed padlocked twice over, a reluctance to drive near industrial parks, and a slip during a casual interview when he referred to David in the past tense before being told the case was reopened. Meanwhile, the family's reopened wounds. Lucas's childhood friends, now adults with children of their own, wept, describing the empty desk in 2nd grade that no one had ever filled. David's sister pulled out a box of his handwriting, lists he'd made of chores and groceries, each line a reminder that his life had been built on care. Their testimonies didn't appear in the forensic reports, but they colored the investigation, reminding every agent that these were not symbols in a file, but people whose laughter had once filled rooms. As the case deepened, the building took on a mythology of its own. Locals whispered about the smell that lingered long after it was abandoned, the way stray dogs barked near it but never entered, and the time a teenager broke in on a dare and came out white-faced, refusing to speak of what he'd seen. The building was no longer just a structure. It was a wound in concrete. And in that wound, the FBI was certain, lay the missing truth about David and Lucas Kincaid. The SUV was the performance. The building was the backstage. And someone still alive had played director. The building did not surrender easily. It stood at the edge of town like a scar no one wanted to admit existed. Its windows bricked, its doors welded, its exterior mottled with graffiti half a decade old. Yet even sealed, it breathed unease. The FBI obtained a warrant not just to enter but to excavate, treating the concrete walls as if they were pages of a hidden diary. The first cut of the welding torch echoed through the valley, a sound sharp enough to make onlookers flinch. Inside, the air was stagnant, thick with the dust of abandonment, and yet the agents moved with the deliberate rhythm of surgeons. Their flashlights swept over rusted machinery, broken pallets, and a floor pocked with stains too old to identify at first glance. It wasn't what they saw, but what they didn't see, that felt louder. No graffiti inside, no sign of teenage trespassers, no evidence of homeless encampments. For 20 years, no one had dared claim it. As if the place itself warned them away, they started with the walls. Chisels and drills revealed hollow pockets, cavities where something once rested or had been deliberately sealed away. Behind one wall, they found a coil of rope, fused stiff with time. Behind another, a length of chain. Both could have been industrial remnants or restraints. They moved next to the floor, using ground-penetrating radar to read what human eyes could not. At first, the screen flickered with static, layers of concrete and rebar distorting the image. But then, shapes emerged. Rectangles within rectangles. Spaces where the density was wrong. A hidden sublevel. The building wasn't just a shell, it was a mask. The excavation team went to work, jackhammers chewing through concrete until the air filled with the metallic tang of dust and sweat. Hours passed before the sound changed from the scream of stone to the hollow knock of a cavity beneath. A square panel was lifted, revealing a stairwell descending into darkness. The lights were lowered first. What they revealed was not a basement but a chamber, a room lined with cinder blocks and fitted with fixtures that didn't belong in an industrial site. A cot frame, a bucket, scratches etched into stone, tally marks, or desperate graffiti. And in one corner, something that silenced the room. A child's toy car, faded blue plastic, its wheels missing, its surface coated in grime, but unmistakable. Lucas had been there. Agents documented everything with precision, but precision could not blunt the ache in their throats. The toy wasn't evidence. It was a voice from 1997, echoing through 26 years of silence. It said he had been alive long enough to play, long enough to scratch walls, and long enough to wait. But wait for what? The chamber suggested captivity, not accident. It suggested days or weeks, not minutes. And that realization reclassified the case again, from disappearance to abduction, from accident to imprisonment. The FBI's behavioral analysts began sketching profiles. Whoever had staged the SUV wanted finality, but whoever had built this room wanted control. The man they'd been watching, the one tied to the lease, the bank withdrawals, and the slip of tongue now sat heavier in their files. But his history raised more questions than answers. He had no prior record of violence, no public eruptions. A man like that doesn't suddenly build a dungeon, unless he didn't build it alone, unless the building had more than one keeper. In interviews, old employees spoke in careful tones. They remembered whispers of off-book storage, rooms no one entered. A delivery driver recalled dropping off pallets after hours, directed to leave them by a side door. He remembered hearing something, a knock, a muffled cry, but had convinced himself it was imagination. That was 25 years ago. and he still hadn't forgiven himself for walking away. Every recollection deepened the labyrinth. If David and Lucas had been held there, what became of them after? The chamber had no remains, no bones, no bodies, just echoes. It was a prison without graves, which meant the trail continued beyond those walls. But where? The search widened outward from the building, tracing roads, drainage lines, and the routes someone desperate would take to dispose of what they no longer wanted seen. Dogs were brought in, their handlers quiet and tense. The animals sniffed the perimeter, tails stiff, pulling toward a ditch behind the property where weeds grew thick and water trickled unseen. There, beneath layers of soil, investigators unearthed fragments, fibers of clothing, a rusted belt buckle, and scraps too degraded to identify by sight alone. Each fragment was bagged, logged, and sent for DNA. Families were told to prepare. The press was told nothing. In the silence between discovery and confirmation, the town shivered. Rumors spread faster than facts. Some said the building was part of something larger, a network of sites designed for disappearances. Others whispered of debt collectors, secret rituals, and underground economies that fed on the desperate. The truth, the FBI knew, would be stranger than rumor, but no less terrible. Because the toy car was real, the tally marks were real. Someone had made a child count his days in a room no child should ever see. And now, after decades of silence, the walls themselves had started to talk. The laboratory confirmation arrived on a gray Tuesday morning, delivered in the sterile cadence of a forensic report. The fibers found near the ditch matched clothing once listed in the missing person inventory. The belt buckle aligned with receipts from a purchase in the late 90s. And most damning of all, the DNA fragments too degraded for a full profile, but strong enough for a familial comparison linked directly to David Miller. For the first time in over 2 decades, the state could declare what had once only been feared. David had not vanished voluntarily, nor had he walked away from his son. He had been held, he had been buried, and he had been silenced. But the most piercing absence remained. No trace of Lucas. The boy who should now be a grown man was still a ghost, suspended in unanswered questions. Was he buried elsewhere, scattered beyond reach? Or had someone taken him from that chamber alive, carrying him into another life built on stolen foundations? The uncertainty kept the agents awake at night, staring at walls that offered no tally marks, listening to silence that refused to answer. The investigation pivoted from discovery to pursuit. The man linked to the lease was no longer just a name on paper. He became the central axis of every lead. They traced his employment, his social circles, and the unexplained gaps in his travel. In interviews, acquaintances described him as helpful, always available with a tool or advice, but strangely evasive about personal matters. He was the kind of neighbor people noticed only when they needed something fixed, and forgot as soon as he turned away. Forgettable, invisible, the perfect mask. The FBI secured surveillance footage from an old gas station that still maintained archives dating back 2 decades. In grainy frames from the summer of 1997, they saw a figure resembling him near the Kincaid exit, his truck loaded with supplies. In the passenger seat sat a shape small enough to be a child, though the blur of pixels prevented certainty. Analysts enhanced the frames until the image crackled at the edge of clarity, a faint outline of blonde hair. A toy, pressed to a window. The toy car, or one just like it. Lucas had been alive after the crash site, after the chamber. Alive and transported. The footage cracked the case open again. What motive explains keeping a child while discarding a father? The behavioral analysts painted theories dark enough to make seasoned agents shift in their chairs. A child can be remade, they said. A child can be erased and rewritten into someone else's story. The search turned obsessive. Old school records were combed, looking for sudden transfers, forged guardianships, and names that appeared without pasts. Adoption databases were scanned for anomalies, children who appeared at age 3 with no medical trail before. They found fragments, inconsistencies, and paper trails that led into cul-de-sacs. The man had covered his tracks well, but even the most careful predators leave shadows. An old acquaintance mentioned a sudden appearance of a boy in his household around 1998. Neighbors remembered the child as quiet, pale, and always kept close. The man had claimed the boy was a nephew whose parents had died in another state. No one questioned it. In a world where tragedy is common, stories of sudden custody seldom meet suspicion. But that boy would now be an adult, perhaps still living under a stolen name. Perhaps unaware of the truth that trailed him like a second skin. Interviews with neighbors revealed strange details. The boy never attended birthday parties, never joined school trips, and never spoke much in public. He existed in the shadows of a man who introduced him only when necessary. Some thought it was strict parenting. Others thought it was shyness. No one considered it might be abduction. The deeper the agents dug, the more the narrative twisted. For every answer, a question grew. Had Lucas been raised under another identity? Did he know who he was? Did he remember the tally marks on a wall, the sound of his father's voice, and the cold concrete floor where he once pushed a toy car in endless circles? If he were alive, would he still be captive? Or had he become something else entirely, folded into a life built on lies? Surveillance units were dispatched, not to chase shadows, but to confirm them. They followed the man's old associates, cross-referenced property records, and mapped connections that spread like cracks through glass. And then, one evening, a tip came from a mechanic in another state. A young man had come in to service his vehicle, and though polite, he seemed strangely nervous when the radio mentioned the reopened 1997 disappearance. The mechanic remembered because the young man dropped his wallet, and inside, the ID looked freshly printed despite claiming a birth year from the late 90s. Too clean, too new. The name meant nothing, but the face bore traces of the missing boy, as if time had stretched him forward but left behind the echo of a child's eyes. The FBI knew it couldn't be a coincidence. They moved cautiously, building a case thread by thread, unwilling to spook someone who might finally be the living answer to 26 years of silence. Yet beneath the careful procedure, a question gnawed. If this was Lucas, had he been saved? Or had he been shaped into someone who would never accept the truth, waiting to claim him? The young man was tracked with meticulous precision. Agents tailed him through the ordinary rhythms of his life: commutes to work, late-night grocery runs, and weekends spent alone in a small rented apartment. He seemed quiet, cautious, and almost withdrawn, as though always listening for footsteps behind him. His coworkers described him as polite but distant, someone who never joined after-work drinks, who flinched at sudden noises, and who never spoke about childhood or family. On paper, his life began abruptly at 18, with documents too flawless to be genuine. No baby photos, no early school records, no medical files before the turn of the millennium. He was a man without a past, carefully written into existence. The agents called him Michael, his chosen name on the forged documents, but in the privacy of their war room, they whispered another: Lucas. They compared photographs, superimposing the boy's features from missing posters over the man's grainy DMV portrait. The slope of the nose, the distance between the eyes, the faint scar above the brow, all aligned with unsettling accuracy. It was him. It had to be. Yet, the question loomed heavier with each confirmation. Did he know? To approach him without unraveling years of careful lies required patience. They intercepted fragments of his digital footprint. His searches were ordinary: how to change oil, cheapest groceries, local weather. Yet buried among them was something that stilled the room. A late-night search asking about memories that feel like dreams. Another asked why someone might remember a basement wall with marks. The agents leaned forward in silence. The tally marks. He remembered, though he did not know why. The decision was made to establish controlled contact. An undercover agent struck up a conversation at the garage where Michael often had his car serviced. They bonded over small things, engines, late-night shifts, and the shared fatigue of solitude. Slowly, a fragile rapport began. The agent listened more than he spoke, leaving silences that Michael seemed compelled to fill, and gradually, fragments slipped through. He said he didn't know where he was born, only that the man who raised him always warned that questions led to trouble. He said sometimes he dreamed of a voice calling his name in the dark, a voice that didn't match the man he called father. The Bureau monitored every word, every inflection. It was like watching a door begin to crack open after decades sealed shut. But timing was everything. If they rushed, he could vanish, retreating into mistrust. If they waited too long, the man who had taken him might resurface, might tighten his grip. The balance was razor thin. Meanwhile, the original suspect, the one who had raised Michael, remained elusive. His last known address was abandoned, filled with dust and silence. Old neighbors recalled him as reclusive, strict with the boy, and often moving from town to town without explanation. Records showed dozens of short-term rentals across multiple states, none lasting more than 2 years. He was a shadow, always one step ahead of suspicion. But his health would be failing by now, if he was even still alive. That uncertainty only heightened the urgency. A breakthrough came from an unexpected angle. An archivist digging through court records unearthed a traffic citation issued in 2005 to the suspect's vehicle. The location was only 30 miles from Michael's current residence. It wasn't proof of continued contact, but it suggested proximity. Perhaps the man had remained nearby, watching, ensuring control even as Michael reached adulthood. Perhaps the leash had never fully loosened. The FBI debated whether to confront Michael with the truth. Behavioral specialists warned of the risks. A man raised under lies for decades might reject reality violently, clinging to the only identity he'd ever known. The trauma could fracture him, undo him, but silence was its own cruelty. He deserved to know why his nights were haunted by tally marks and voices from the dark. The decision came to stage a controlled reveal. They would not barge in with badges and accusations. Instead, they arranged a meeting framed as a casual discussion, led by the same undercover agent Michael trusted. They chose a neutral space, a diner off a quiet road, all chrome and faded booths, the kind of place that hummed with anonymity. Surveillance teams filled the corners, invisible but ready. Michael arrived late, shoulders hunched, eyes darting. He slid into the booth across from the agent, his hands restless against the cracked vinyl. The conversation began like always, mundane, measured. But then the agent slid a photograph across the table. It was old, grainy, and sun-faded. A man and a boy beside a battered SUV, smiling awkwardly in the glow of summer. The boy held a toy car in his hand. Michael stared at it for a long time. His lips parted slightly, breath caught. "Why do I know this?" he whispered. His voice trembled, caught between recognition and disbelief. The agent didn't answer, only watched as the silence pressed harder. Michael touched the photograph with shaking fingers, tracing the child's face. "That's me, isn't it?" The question hung there, heavy, final. It was the first time he had spoken it aloud. The first time the wall of his life cracked wide enough for truth to seep through. The FBI had waited 26 years for that moment. But even as relief coursed through the team listening from hidden earpieces, another fear coiled tight. If Michael Lucas was beginning to remember, then so might the man who had stolen him. And if that man was still out there, still watching, the most dangerous chapter of the story had only just begun. The photograph lingered on the table between them, its edges curling like it wanted to fold back into the past. Michael or Lucas, though he had yet to accept the name, stared at it as though the paper itself were a mirror showing a face he didn't know he'd worn. The undercover agent didn't push. Silence was a tool now, sharper than words. At last, Michael's voice cracked through it. "That man," he said, pointing to David. "Who is he?" The agent breathed slowly, rehearsed lines colliding with the rawness of the moment. "He was your father." The word landed like a stone dropped into water, rippling outward. Michael blinked hard, as if trying to focus on a picture blurred by rain. He shook his head. Once, twice, the denial instinctive. "No, no, my dad." His throat closed on the word. The man who had raised him had never been tender, never called him son with softness, and never let him out of sight. And yet, to abandon that anchor meant floating in a sea of nothing. The agent slid another photograph forward. Lucas, at 5 years old, cheeks flushed, Velcro shoes flashing with cartoon stars. "This was you, before." Michael gripped the edge of the table until his knuckles whitened. His breath came shallow, and for a moment the diners hummed the clatter of plates. The murmur of other patrons faded under the roar in his ears. "Why are you showing me this?" His voice was low, almost pleading. "Because the life you've been living isn't yours. It was built on lies. And the man who raised you isn't who he told you he was." The words threatened to shatter him. He stood abruptly, the booth scraping loud enough to draw eyes. Surveillance agents tensed, ready to intervene. But the undercover agent raised a calming hand. "Sit down, Michael. Please." After a pause that felt like a cliff edge, he did. But his eyes burned, wet and furious. "Don't call me that. Don't call me Michael. And don't call me whatever that other name was. I don't know who I am." The pain in his voice was sharper than any confession. For a long time, the agent said nothing. Then, gently, "That's what we're here to help you find out." The FBI debrief that followed was cautious. Michael left the diner shaken, carrying a copy of the photograph in his pocket like a burning coal. He didn't agree to cooperate fully, but he didn't run either. And that, in itself, was a crack of light through the darkness. But cracks invite pressure. Within 48 hours of that meeting, surveillance detected movement connected to the original suspect. A man matching his description, older now, gaunt, shoulders bent, was spotted entering a pay-by-the-week motel outside town. His presence was too precise, too coincidental. Someone had tipped him off. Maybe he'd been watching Michael all along. The motel room, viewed through a telephoto lens, told a story of flight. Suitcases half-packed, burner phones lined up like soldiers, and maps folded and refolded until their creases wore thin. And taped above the bed a single photograph. Michael, at around 10 years old, expression hollow, shoulders slumped. Proof that the man had never let go, that even in hiding he clung to his possession. The FBI debated immediate arrest versus prolonged surveillance. A premature move might spook him into vanishing forever, taking with him the last chance for answers about what had happened in 1997. But waiting carried its own risk. If he realized Michael had been approached, he might act desperate and dangerous. They chose to wait, to watch, to gather every strand of evidence into a net tight enough to hold. They wired the motel and tracked his movements. At night, he muttered to himself, pacing. Fragments picked up on the bug-made skin crawl. He's mine. No one else. Doesn't remember. Not yet. Meanwhile, Michael wrestled with his new identity in silence. He pinned the photo of young Lucas to his fridge, staring at it each time he opened the door, half hoping it would fade away. But the memories it stirred were undeniable. The tally marks on concrete, the smell of mildew, a voice humming tunelessly in the dark. He had always thought those were dreams. Now he knew they were the marrow of his life. One night, he called the undercover agent, his voice hoarse. "I remember a basement. I remember scratching lines into the wall. Was that real?" The agent's reply was steady. Yes, it was real. The silence that followed was unbearable. The sound of a man realizing his entire foundation was rot. And then, as if fate itself twisted the knife, Michael said something that froze the room when the recording was played back to the team. "I think he's still watching me." Because in that moment, standing outside Michael's apartment in the shadows, no camera had yet captured. The suspect had been there, watching, waiting. The motel room smelled of stale cigarette smoke and the cheap hotel cologne that clung to curtains and linens in places where time pools and forgetfulness settles. From the unblinking distance of their surveillance van, the agents watched him move like a man possessed by small rituals. A folded note slid into a wallet, a photograph smoothed flat, a boot heel tapped against the carpet in an absent rhythm. He had no idea how many eyes followed him. He moved as if the world were still his to command. That confidence had to be boxable, containable scientists of shadow working in tandem to close the space around him. The decision to act came at dawn, not with the kinetic razzle of a TV raid, but with slow, methodical precision. Lights went up along the motel's perimeter like small suns waking armored vehicles, cameras on cranes, and officers in plain clothes blending into a simmering breakfast crowd. The operation was surgical, no showmanship, no premature noise, because they knew better than to give a predator the luxury of surprise. An arrest could either unlock a decades-old archive of truth or scatter it forever into the wind. Inside the motel, the man moved with the same mechanical calm that had unnerved the team. He put a kettle on the hot plate, then poured a cup of coffee so weak it might as well have been room-temperature water. That ordinary domesticity was the most dangerous camouflage. Years of hiding teach you to favor the banal as armor. That was his mistake. He used habit as an invisible shield, believing routine would keep him invisible. Outside, the team closed in. The lead detective, grimed with sleeplessness but steady as cut stone, kept a hand on the radio and a mind on the margins. On my mark. 2 doors down. Plainclothes breach. No flash. Contain interior exits. If he bolts, funnel him to the east courtyard. The voice was competence incarnate. The room holding the tactical plan smelled faintly of styrofoam and cold takeout. On a chalkboard, the timeline of 1997, scrawled in black marker, looked like a jigsaw. Someone kept rearranging. A soft knock on the motel door. The man's head turned, and then he came to the door. For a breathless moment, the world contracted to that hinge, and a single syllable. Morning? The voice at the threshold sounded human and unthreatening, and it worked. The man cracked the door enough to speak. That millimeter was the difference between suspicion and surrender. The agents had rehearsed his face into the language of possible futures. They saw it soften, an old reflex of trust taking hold. The detective at the door produced clips of paper warrants and certifications that smelled faintly of ink and authority. "We need to ask you some questions about a case from the late 90s. The man's pupils tightened. He smiled too wide, the kind of smile people choose when they are packing their bodies for deceit. "I told you, I don't want trouble." The polite cadence of an old act. Those minutes were missiles. Through the thin drywall, the rest of the team positioned themselves. A flash team near the rear exit, an evidence crew ready in case of any attempt to jettison incriminating items, and a negotiator tuned to voices. Everyone was tuned like an instrument to one note: containment. He asked for a cigarette, hands shaking only a fraction. He walked to the window and paused, the motel's neon sign painting horizontal bruises on his knuckles. For a brief second, he looked like a man reconsidering a life's architecture. Then he jammed the cigarette into his mouth and turned back on the world, back into performance. The agent saw it then. Not a man unhitched from reality, but someone who had kept a ledger of control, who'd kept the past in a pocket and polished it nightly. Inside the room, the detective's voice softened an old technique. "Put the suspect back into the idea of choice. We can make this easier on you if you cooperate." The man laughed. It sounded like gravel. "You don't have me. I know how to vanish." But he did not move for an escape, and that hesitation told the team more than a confession ever could. Fear had entered the equation. Predators fear loss of the story they've authored. They fear the end. The entry was quiet. A two-man team, a deliberate practiced push that used surprise without violence. The suspect reacted too slowly, as if the sudden motion needed permission to become movement in his muscles. He went for a side table where a small metal box sat like a heart, and in the same quick choreography, a bead of sweat rolled down his temple and into the history he could not wash. One agent secured his hands behind his back. The other reached for the metal box with gloved certainty and the reverberations of 30 years of questions. They placed him in a chair. He talked without being asked, a slow spill, a life sliding out, as if the words had been stored long enough to soften, but not to vanish. He pieced his sentences with the careful cruelty of an architect, explaining why he built a bridge, not why he wrecked it. They left him, he said. They left the boy. I found him. Every syllable was a trapdoor. The man spoke of a night, of misplaced headlights on a back road, of two shapes in fog. He spoke of a decision, quick and absolute, like a blinking red light on the dashboard of a car that refuses to stop. He confessed to certain acts that fit the outline of the case: abandonment, concealment, and the shaping of identities. But there were slivers of omission 3 nights that the team still could not plot. One motel they say he never booked, and a white pickup he once denied owning. His narrative was full of neatness, where mess should have been. The neatness rang false. They presented photo after photo, faces of the missing, places where they had been last seen, and artifacts recovered and analyzed. He flinched at certain images, not all. The agent tapped a photograph. A crushed SUV half swallowed by brush, its roof caved, the license plate long gone. The man did not turn pale. He regarded it as if it were a photograph of a past season. That non-reaction registered as an arrhythmia. The team catalogued. Back outside the motel, the surveillance van recorded movements across towns. People who once orbited the suspect and those who'd vanished when pressure came. The team worked the phone lines like miners, sprinting through decades of cellular ghosts, calling numbers that had been dead and resurrecting the shape of a conspiracy, a network of small complicities. In the interrogation room, his voice became crystalline. "You have to understand," he whispered. "We all wanted to fix something that was broken." It was a chilling deflection, a claim of moral architecture built atop monstrous acts. It begged the question, did he mean to protect or to own? At dawn's second light, the tactical team found, under the motel's loose floorboard, a bundle wrapped in plastic. Inside were letters, told as if in code, and a map with a single line traced to a place where the world erases itself into scrub. The map's fold marks matched the weary habits of hands that had used it often. The coordinates pointed to an old crash site, one scavengers had whispered about but no investigator had been able to reach. The discovery pushed the investigation into uncharted momentum. As they loaded him into the squad car, he looked at Michael No, Lucas, now through the glass, like a man seeing the ripples he'd made finally cross the surface. "You were supposed to remember," he said, almost gently. "You were supposed to remember and go away." The sentence hung with implication. Someone had wanted the past buried by memory itself. The drive to headquarters was scored by the muted sound of police radios. In a room that had seen the slow collapse of many secrets, agents prepared for the next act, searching the mapped crash site, extracting answers from layers of rot and time, and facing the wicked probability that what they would find might rewrite everything they had assumed. Outside, a lone crow turned in a pallid sky. The landscape held its breath, as if it too awaited the unspooling of a long-hidden ledger. The map was a confession in paper form. Its folds were creased from years of use, its edges softened by the oil of hands that had studied it too often. And it carried the weight of intent. The line traced across its surface did not lead to a highway or a town, but into the throat of wilderness, a forgotten canyon where scrubgrass chewed at stone and storms cut veins into the soil. It was the kind of place hunters whispered about and hikers avoided, a place outside the reach of routine. At first light, the FBI convoy crawled down a dirt road that broke into nothing. Dust plumed behind their vehicles, settling in their lungs like history trying to choke them. They parked where the road ended and continued on foot, boots grinding against gravel. The canyon swallowed them gradually, its walls rising higher, its silence heavy as a verdict. The only sound was the crunch of boots and the low murmur of radios. The coordinates brought them to a hollow in the canyon floor, a scar of blackened earth where lightning had once struck. The soil was darker and charred, and at first it seemed the map had led them to emptiness. But trained eyes noticed the inconsistencies. A pattern in the ground where weeds grew too uniformly, rocks that seemed deliberately placed, unnatural in their arrangement. The excavation team set to work, shovels scraping, brushes whispering against dirt, until the hollow revealed its truth. The first artifact was a zipper, corroded but intact, the teeth still linked together as if protecting something long since gone. Then came fragments of cloth, threads fused into clumps by fire or time. Deeper still, they found bone not whole, but fragments that whispered of a body once complete. Each discovery was logged with reverence, bagged as if the act itself were a prayer. The site had been a grave, clumsy but deliberate, an attempt at erasure undone by the arrogance of memory. And then, beneath a layer of carefully placed stone, they found something that silenced even the most seasoned agents: a wallet. Its leather was cracked, its contents fused together, but inside, protected by chance or by something more, was a photograph. A man and a boy standing in front of a playground slide, the boy's hair a mess of blonde curls, the man's arm wrapped around his son with a pride that needed no words. The photograph was of David and Lucas, frozen in time before the canyon claimed their story. The agents stared at it in silence. It wasn't evidence. It was a message, a keepsake buried with intent, as if the man who had stolen Lucas couldn't quite destroy every tether. Perhaps it had been guilt. Perhaps arrogance. Perhaps both. But whatever the reason, it was proof that the canyon was more than a dumping ground. It had been a stage for grief, performed in secret. Back at headquarters, the suspect sat in a cell, silent except for the occasional mutterings to himself. He refused food and refused questions. His eyes remained fixed on the wall, as if replaying a film no one else could see. "You think the truth saves him?" he murmured once to an agent standing guard. "But the truth only kills twice." Meanwhile, Michael Lucas was taken to a secure location, away from cameras and questions. He was shown the photograph recovered from the canyon. His hands trembled as he held it, his breath coming in ragged bursts. He stared at the image for a long time before whispering, "I know that day." His voice was fragile, like glass under pressure. "I remember the slide. My dad pushed me, and I fell, and we laughed so hard." It was the first clear memory unlocked, the first undeniable bridge between his fractured present and the stolen past. Tears slipped down his face as he clutched the photograph. "He was real," he whispered. "I didn't imagine him." For the first time, the void in his identity had a shape, and that shape was love. But the canyon had not yielded all its secrets. Further excavation revealed tire tracks fossilized in clay, wide enough to match the suspect's old truck. Soil samples showed traces of accelerant, confirming attempts to burn what could not be buried. And yet, there was no sign of Lucas's body. The boy had not died there. The canyon was David's grave, but not his son's. This truth reshaped the case once more. If Lucas had been taken from the canyon alive, then the man had made a choice. He had decided who would live and who would die, who would be erased and who would be rewritten. That decision was more monstrous than any accident, more deliberate than any rumor. It was the theft of a life, the remaking of a boy into something he was never meant to be. The agents returned to their files, piecing together timelines. The canyon burial aligned with the weeks following the disappearance. The motel records, the forged documents, and the sudden appearance of a nephew in the suspect's household all confirmed the pattern. The evidence was a web, and at its center was the truth. David had been silenced in the canyon, and Lucas had been stolen into another life. The press caught wind of the excavation. Headlines blared about bones in the canyon, about secrets unearthed. Families held vigils, and strangers left flowers at makeshift memorials. The town, once resigned to forgetting, now found itself staring into the hollow of its own history. Yet even as answers surfaced, the darkest question remained. If Lucas had been alive when taken, what had been done to him in the years since? The interrogation room was a square of steel and silence, a place designed to strip performance from liars. But the man at the table still wore his mask. His wrists rested calmly on the surface, his voice low and steady, as though he were lecturing a class no one wanted to attend. For days he had evaded with fragments, half-truths, and twisted narratives. But the canyon had spoken, and the toy car, the tally marks, and the photograph they had all piled into a mountain no denial could climb. The agents pressed him, hour after hour, until finally his composure cracked like a wall struck one too many times. He was supposed to forget, he whispered, staring at the floor. That was the plan. Children forget. They're soft like clay. I gave him a new life, better than the one he would have had. His words dripped with conviction, a delusion forged over decades of self-justification. When asked why he had killed David, his face hardened. The boy needed me. The man didn't. He was an obstacle. Obstacles are removed. The agents leaned in, their voices sharp. Where is Lucas now? The man smiled faintly, the expression of someone convinced he still held control. He's right where you want him. He's been in front of you this whole time. He's the man you call Michael. The admission was both revelation and confirmation. For 26 years, the boy everyone searched for had been living inside another identity, shaped by lies, raised under shadows, and stripped of his name. The suspect spoke of it like a victory, as though survival under his hand proved his righteousness. He's strong because of me. He knows discipline. He knows fear. Those are gifts. But outside the interrogation room, Michael sat in a different chamber, his hands gripping the photograph of his father until the edges tore. He had listened to pieces of the confession through a speaker, his face pale, his jaw tight. Every word was acid, burning away the fragile balance he had tried to build since learning the truth. The man he had once called father had admitted to murder, to theft, to rewriting his very existence. An agent placed a hand gently on his shoulder. You don't have to listen anymore. Michael shook his head, his voice raw. I need to know everything he took. When the interrogation ended, the suspect was led away, his eyes still burning with the arrogance of a man who believed history would remember him as more than a thief of lives. He would stand trial for murder, kidnapping, unlawful imprisonment, and a catalog of crimes woven from decades of deception. But no sentence could return what he had stolen. For Michael, the reckoning was just beginning. In the weeks that followed, he began therapy, with specialists trained in unmasking trauma buried beneath years of conditioning. Memories came in fragments. His father's laugh, the sound of gravel under SUV tires, and the cold of the chamber walls. Each piece stitched together a truth he had once thought was a dream. He visited the canyon, standing at the edge where his father's remains had been found. The air was dry, heavy with silence, but in that silence, he whispered words only the stones heard. I remember you now. I won't forget again. If you emmened him, at a vigil held in town, hundreds gathered with candles. The photograph of David and Lucas was placed at the center, surrounded by flowers, tokens, and handwritten notes from strangers who had carried their story in silence. Michael stood at the edge of the crowd, the flicker of candles reflecting in his eyes. He felt both apart from them and a part of them, a man reborn into his true name yet still learning how to wear it. When the final charges were read aloud in court, the town exhaled a breath it had been holding since 1997. Justice, delayed but undeniable, had arrived. But justice is not restoration. For the family, for Michael, for all who had searched, there remained the scar of years stolen. A father buried in a canyon, a boy raised in captivity, and a life fractured and rebuilt. And yet, within that scar, hope found its root. Hope that Michael could live not as a shadow, but as himself. Hope that the truth, unearthed after decades, would finally silence the lies. Hope that the memory of David, his care, his devotion, his love, would be the anchor that carried Michael forward. The story of a father and son missing since 1997 did not end in wilderness or rumor. It ended in truth, uncovered piece by piece, bone by bone, memory by memory, until the silence could no longer hold. And as the candles guttered in the night air, the story closed not with disappearance but with survival. Survival scarred, survival reshaped, but survival nonetheless. If you found this story haunting and want to hear more tales where the truth hides beneath decades of silence, don't forget to subscribe. There are more stories waiting in the dark, and together, we'll bring them to light.